It's now my pleasure to introduce to you Nick Lovegrove. Nick is Senior Director at Albright Stonebridge Group and has been a friend of the school for a number of years. I'm not sure if it's that friendship that's given him superhuman powers, but we nevertheless asked Nick to attend 3 parallel sessions in parallel, and he's done a very fine job of that. Fortunately for him, he has some help in the form of the co-chairs of the panels. So for those of you who, unlike Nick, were only able to be in one place at one time, I'll just briefly introduce them. Maya Chida is University Lecturer in Government and Public Policy at the Blavatnik School of Government. Tom Hale is Postdoctoral Researcher at the Blavatnik School of Government. And Monica Toft is a Professor in Government and Public Policy at the Blavatnik School. It's the home team, refereed by someone who's from another team, but that plays very friendlily with our side. They're going to sum up for us.
Well, I was trying to think whether this is the hardest job I'd ever had, summarising 3 parallel sessions, or the easiest job, because all I have to do is to introduce the leaders of each of the sessions. I decided to go the easy route and just simply introduce the leaders of each of the sessions. I did get to see each of them. At each point I arrived, something interesting was being discussed, so I know these were great sessions. But I'm going to ask each of the panel leaders to say, first of all, what their session was about, what was the sort of governing question, and then what were the 2 or 3 most powerful insights that they took away. And if all of those insights came from one person on the panel, then maybe we'll have learned something. But I suspect it was a sort of synthesis of points made by a number of colleagues on the panel. So Thomas Hale, why don't you start? Your session was called Can People Power Development?
Thank you, Nick. Our session was looking at the themes of the conference from a slightly different perspective than the opening plenary did. Whereas that plenary was looking at how people and citizens could hold governments to account, who could drive policy from activism from below, our session was looking at how governments and policymakers could respond and be more effective at policymaking if they treat people as people. And our entry point for that was a development in the social sciences and in economics in particular, which has been complicating the standard models of human beings as rational economic actors, looking at them not just as consumers or as incentive-driven individuals, but as complex human beings full of psychology, of social norms, of cultural biases, and all the other things that we in the world recognize as very important for people in power. Our entry point here was the World Development Report 2015, which the World Bank publishes every year. And this year it was looking at how these insights affect the world of development. So we had a rich laboratory to discuss these issues. There was really a lot of exciting examples of how policymakers can or might use these kinds of ideas to beef up their policymaking and make it more effective. Let me say some of the few that struck me as most exciting. In Kenya, there's a problem with bus drivers not driving very safely. This is had real public health benefits. The government didn't really know how to solve it. They found a solution in a small sticker, a 10-cent sticker that was put in buses that said, and correct me if I don't have the wording just right, if I'm driving unsafely, stand up and tell me. And this is a small little nudge. It asks people to become active, actively hold people to account in a very local, specific context, and it reduced accidents by 50%. So here's an example of how people can be empowered through the right government policies to actually make policymaking much more effective. Another example that was actually written up in the New York Times this past weekend comes from here in the UK, where the government behavioral unit asked job seekers looking for work to write an essay about what they would do to look for work. Not just to say, well, if you come back to the job center, we'll try to find you something, but actually asked them to reflect on it and to think of what they would do to achieve those goals. And there, they found that just the act of thinking through the process actually made people much more likely to find their jobs. So there's some really exciting examples of how these kinds of behavioral insights into human behavior can make government policymaking more effective. But also raises questions. One of the discussions that arose around our panel and generated some heat was, when does nudge become shove? When are people manipulated into this? And can actually these tools for empowering people in the wrong hands or to the wrong ends become a tool, not for empowerment, but for manipulation? And here I think the conclusion, if I can put a rough finish on a very rich conversation was that there's no substitution here for accountability, for democracy, for the rule of law, for institutional capacity. All those things are important too. What these things do is just add another tool to the kit that policymakers have for enacting change. And I was really struck that the most effective sort of policies that were highlighted were often ones that empowered people. And so there was a real connection between the theme of the conference, people power, and governments being able to enact policy in a more effective way.
But just one sort of follow-up question to your own question about when does nudge become sharp. Presumably there is a concern, or there was a concern in the panel, that the best intentioned gentle nudge can be perceived, can be received as if it's an instruction or even a rule. And was there a discussion about how you find that fine line between empowerment and enforcement?
I don't think we had a general rule. I mean, the key lesson that came out of the panel was that here's a list of really interesting insights that show that we need to care a lot about specific contexts that policies happen in. You can't generalize. It's all about finding the right solution for the right problem at the right time. And so the implication was that we need to be attentive to this danger. There's not a list of criteria we can check off to say that we've met it or not. It's really about treating each issue as a unique case.
I don't know if is Varun Gary here, the co-author of the World? Yeah. If I could ask you, the choice of topic for the World Development Report is carefully thought about, and it's a signalling mechanism. It's a means of reflecting to the world what the bank cares about and think are the big issues of the time. What does it say about the agenda of the bank, the strategy of the bank, that this topic has been chosen?
Well, I think there's a recognition inside the World Bank that we need to broaden the policymakers' toolkit, that culture is very important, and we need to be thinking about the actual concepts and mental models that people have. Prices and regulation aren't the whole story. And I think there's also, you may know, an effort to change the internal culture inside the World Bank. We have a president who's an anthropologist, although he talks about being a doctor more than being an anthropologist. He's also an anthropologist. He's aware of the importance of culture, and so I think that also played a role in the choice of topics. I would add one thing, which is that I think there's an understanding that we want to nudge people, that's a useful policy instrument, but there's nudges and there's broad social change too, which is often about culture. And some of the biggest changes in development occur from broad changes in culture, broad changes in norms that are crucial. We want to highlight that many of the big leaps in development occur from these big changes and not just changes in prices.
Terrific, thank you very much. I'd love to open it up for further discussion, but that would defeat the objective of having the small parallel session. So we'll move on to the next one. Monica Duffy-Toft, also a professor here at the Blavatnik School, led a session on driving demands, stability, sustainability, and growth. Monica.
So our panel had Jonathan Wetzel and Jack Goldstone from, Jonathan was from McKinsey and Jack is from George Mason University. And we sort of looked at force majeures, or major trends that are happening globally, in particular demographic trends, but also large-scale urbanization, looking both globally, historically, but then also at the case of China, and how China may be an exceptional case or may not be, such that we can learn lessons from it. And sort of three big takeaways from the panel was, and Jonathan made a nice point, that once urbanization happens, people don't de-urbanize. And so we're sort of on this trajectory. I hate to be teleological and determinative, but the idea, unless there's plague, Jack pointed out, like as a good academic, historical sociologist, that actually we have seen cities decline in plague and disease and that sort of thing. But generally speaking, once you have urbanization, it's going to happen. Right now, China's at 45%. By 2030, it's going to be 60%, and the equilibrium that Jack highlighted is 85%. That you can have an economy of 15% agriculture supporting 85%, so long as it's governed properly. Which led us to our second big point, which was about responsible governance. And the question is how is it that China has been so resilient? How has it been able to manage well its urbanization, and is it exceptional? We debated that back and forth, and to some extent we do think it is exceptional because it does have such a heavy hand in the distribution of resources across that society. So it made us discuss and question whether cities, governors of cities such as Nairobi and Cairo are going to be able to do the same thing. And also an interesting discussion about slums and how slums are actually sort of the leading edge of entrepreneurship, and that it's sort of an artifact if you want urbanization. Unfortunately, they come with it. And the last came back with sort of the people powers, talking about the values that are going to underpinning some of these major trends. So the one is urbanization, large scale. Humanity's never seen anything like it. The second is aging, where we have large-scale aging among industrialized societies. And what does that mean? In the UK, we're debating pension plans, and 2030, it's going to go to 70 for retirement plans. But then in other parts of the world, you have a youth, and it would be nice if we could just shift them, right? Take the youth, move them to Europe. We can have service industries provided for. But it raises issues of inequity and distribution across generations. And so we discussed that. And the critical issue, back to this morning's plenary panel, is the values that are going to undergird these local societies and then us as a global humanity. What are we going to privilege? Which values? Is GDP per capita enough as the metric to determine what is good growth and what is not good growth? Or do we need another set of metrics for how we're thinking about these major trends that are confronting societies differently, but they're going to impact us all across the next 20 to 40 years.
It was very interesting for me. I came in just as you were discussing sort of demographics and expectations, and it was a reflection of the fact that 10, 15 years ago, I think we all thought the effect of aging populations would be that we'd all retire earlier, and we'd be able to retire, with relative prosperity in our 50s, and then, live many years of blissful retirement. Now, I think the general assumption is people will retire later, and more reluctantly in many ways, if ever. And I heard Jonathan, my former colleague at McKinsey, talk about how, the second act, which I hope I'm in, maybe there'll be others here who are in the second act, but that seems to have been a big change. It's happened in a relatively short time.
That's right. Within the last 5 years, I think serious discussion about we're going to have to do something about retirement and aging and social security systems in place. And China is dealing with it. And so one of the questions that's on everybody's lips that came up is China going to grow before it ages, or is it going to age before it grows? And what will that mean if it ages before it grows? So exactly. So Western Europe is now dealing with that, trying to deal with sort of aging societies. And the idea that we may, as working beings, social beings, have to reevaluate what it means to be employed across our entire lifespan. That we may not retire until we're 80. Health benefits, we're more healthy today. And is 60 the new 40 and 80 the new 60?
I can't remember. There's one other point that I think I heard in the discussion, but I didn't. I just wanted to sort of make sure we talk about it a little bit. One of the effects of this mass urbanization is that persistently you put poverty and wealth very close, in very close proximity. You talked about slums, you talked about, and it's interesting that the politics of that do change from time to time. So for instance, we've just seen a mayoral election in New York, when a really quite left-wing candidate has won, basically on this sort of anti-Manhattan sort of vote. I mean, in fact, basically the anti-Upper West Side, Upper East Side vote, essentially saying New York's been run for too long for the wealthy, and now it needs to rebalance. And I wonder whether we're going to see more of that. There's been, urbanization has done pretty well for some people, but not for others.
And I think Jack, more so than Jonathan, thinks there's higher risk than Jonathan sees. Jonathan made the interesting point that even within these slum areas, if we want to describe it as that, the quality of life is higher than what those people would have faced had they stayed in the rural areas. Whereas Jack seemed have a bit more trepidation. Now he's looking at Cairo, he's looking at different cities, but the sense was that, there'll probably be some tensions, but in a good way that they can be fed through the political system, that people can vocalize and put pressure on the political system to have a greater or more efficient distribution of wealth across these localities.
Great. Thank you very much, Monica. And finally, Maya Chida, a university lecturer here who, at the Blavatnik School, who led a session on youth activism and citizen empowerment.
Thank you. So I think there were really two overarching questions which we were discussing in the session on youth activism. And the first question was, what really makes activism youth activism, right? So in a time when nearly half, 48% of the world's population is currently under the age of 18, what makes activism youth activism? And that was something that both the panel and various questions from the audience helped to clarify or move forward. And we came up with 3 or 4 ways in which youth activism is distinct. And the first is a certain amount of energy and a sense of can-do that the younger generation is particularly embodies. The second was sort of a novel perspective that we can do things differently because of a lack of entrenchment in established political institutions or autonomy from those institutions. And finally, there was a discussion about, I think Al-Hassan in particular mentioned that there's a clear difference in the lack of family responsibility, and then that translates into sort of less risk aversion that enables youth to be to sort of take to the streets more readily than perhaps other parts of the population. That was the first question. And the second theme that came out actually quite strongly in both Al-Hassan and Valentina's questions and answers was the importance of building long-term professional institutions that both predate and endure after sort of crowds take to the streets in a moment of euphoria. And I've written down sort of 6 ways in which, both in the discussion and in the presentations, the importance of building these institutions or ways in which these institutions can be built. So Valentina in particular talked about the importance of taking a single idea or a clear idea and making sure that that idea resonates really broadly, right? Repeating that idea, making sure that this idea is one which the public can readily digest and understand. The second was the importance of professionalism. Building, when one thinks of some movements, the Occupy movement comes to mind, right? One can think of sort of images of disorganization, perhaps competing voices comes to mind. And there was this really the importance of building a professional institution, in particular that can engage with the media in a professional manner, was a really important aspect of building enduring youth movement. The third was independence from established political parties. Valentina in particular mentioned that her movement, which is elected a number of people into the Chilean parliament, had been asked as the movement was growing to engage with particular parties, platforms, and essentially join with them, and that they were very clear to keep themselves separate, and that independence was incredibly valuable in gaining the trust of the broader population. The fourth was sort of really knowing your issue, doing your homework, knowing your research well. That's in part being professional, but it's also so that when the moment comes for change, you might not know when Tahrir Square is going to fill with crowds. But if you've done your homework and you know your issue well, and you've built an institution in this way, then you can take advantage of the moment when it does come. We had also talked about the importance of dialoguing with all stakeholders. So sort of that all stakeholders could either be for or against or indifferent, and that if you opened lines of communication with all of these stakeholders, no matter what their perspective was on the issue you were trying to promote or change, that would help your cause. And finally, that not all strategies work at all places at all times, that you have to alternate big, explosive, sexy campaigns with the smaller, harder work of building institutions and canvassing door to door. That internet campaigns were perhaps more appropriate in areas where it was difficult to, in autocratic regimes, where it was difficult to come out in public spaces, and that perhaps that was more actually canvassing and entering in public spaces was more appropriate at different times, and that good, effective institutions utilizes all of these strategies just at different times and different places.
Well, thank you very much. I think these three sessions, and I'm conscious we're going to wrap up now for lunch, but each of these sessions have addressed in different ways the sort of ask and response between government and citizens of different ages and demographics and geographies. It's interesting to me to reflect. We just passed the 50th anniversary of the death of President Kennedy, and in that time, when a number of us, particularly in the US, have reflected upon the kinds of things he talked about, one of the most iconic phrase that he used was, "Ask not what your country can do for you, but for what you can do for your country." And implied in that is that engagement between government and people is a mutual process, and there is an ask of the citizen. And I think it's interesting to reflect how many governments actually effectively do that, how many governments effectively ask of their people anything, really. I think living in the US as I do now, one of the, in a way, disappointments of the Obama administration is that it hasn't effectively asked of the people anything, really. I mean, it hasn't, there have been token efforts, but it hasn't gone much beyond asking people to vote for it. And that's not enough in modern society, and you feel like there must be more. And I think as a session and as this conference goes on, I hope we'll debate some more about how governments can ask more of their people, because I suspect there's a lot more that those people can deliver. But I think these three sessions have teed that up brilliantly well. I'm very grateful to the panel leaders. And if I could just say, as somebody who went through all three sessions, obviously not all at the same time, I thought they were fascinating. There was one criticism I would make of all of them, and it's, I say, only so that future panels and so on can learn from this. It was sometimes quite difficult to hear people because they were talking quite quietly. I see some nodding heads, and I think people felt that a little bit. The amplification could possibly be raised in some of the rooms, and/or people could just speak a bit louder, just so that we could all. I'm trying to exemplify this by speaking reasonably loudly at the moment to illustrate my point, so that as we wrap up and go into lunch, we can look forward to future sessions this afternoon and tomorrow. But in the meantime, I'd just like to thank all of the panelists in the sessions this morning, and particularly the chairs. Thank you very much.